Daniel King is wrong a lot, isn't he? All apologists are, but he seems to keep doubling down on his own religious insanity. This is a very long series of supposed proofs for God, none of which, at least so far, have been remotely impressive. But this one is going to be different, right? I can feel it. So take a deep breath and let's dive right in. So we're back to Daniel King on what I might consider his first real proof for God. And I'll tell you right now, it's not going to go well. This is wishful thinking with a side helping of "give me your money" baked in. This time, though, we're going to check out his take on the cosmological argument and show why it's so absolutely pointless to everybody but the religiously deluded. So let's strap in for the first part of his video, because this is going to get really, really bumpy.
Let's talk about the cosmological proof that God is real.
If you really want to, I guess, but we'll get back to that in a second. I did want to point out that this is a very, very long video. His original's about 13 minutes long, and if I tried to put it all into a single response, it would take forever, at least an hour from where I'm sitting here. So I'm going to break this up into two videos. I think this is one of, if not the longest video he's done, at least in the first bunch, so I hope I don't have to do this very often. This is also the first in his Proof for God series, where he's approaching one of the classic apologetic arguments. It's not a good argument by any means, as we're going to see, but this is the first place I figure, since I haven't seen any further than this, that he's going to actually try, stress try, to prove God, or baldly rationalize God, which is far more likely. So let's get started. Go strut on stage, Daniel. I think your ego is writing checks that your arguments just can't cash. Jeez, remember checks? Those were once a thing, weren't they?
Proof. God is real. This is the evidence from cause. Premise A. Everything that exists must have a cause.
And in a second, you're going to violate that by claiming that God doesn't have a cause. And that means, logically, that either God doesn't exist, or that your entire premise is wrong. Of course, pointing that out to the religious never ever goes well, does it? They just make excuses for why their own premise falls under the weight of its own stupidity. Because this isn't about coming up with a rational, self-consistent, logical model. It's about stroking their fifis. This is where we really need to start asking the hard questions that they have no answers to. We already know that things like quarks don't have any apparent cause. They exist. They also pop into and out of existence all the time with no rhyme or reason that we've seen. This is the problem with ideas like causation. Things that people take to be absolutely true when clearly they're not. It's when you take general ideas to be absolutely true across the spectrum of reality that you run into trouble, and the entire cosmological argument is based on that very faulty assertion. Who says that everything that exists has to have a cause? I'd like to see that objectively demonstrated in 100% of the cases. Go right ahead. This ought to be fun.
Premise B. This cause must be a great causer.
Causer isn't a word. This is one place among many where they need to define their terms because, as in most places, the religious are really slippery when it comes to their definitions. What do you mean by great? If you take a pebble to the top of a steep, snowy hill and you drop it, you might get an avalanche. Was that pebble the great causer? Okay, but I'm not going to say that because that sounds absolutely stupid. Was the pebble great, though? Great in air quotes. No, because it's just a tiny hunk of rock. It worked in conjunction with stored kinetic energy stored in the snowpack to create the end result, but the pebble itself wasn't anything special. Yet it is undeniable that without that rock or some kind of similar cause, the avalanche wouldn't have started. So this entire idea is just dumb on its face, but try getting the religious to admit that.
Premise C. The only causer great enough would be God.
Says who? Because that's just a bald assertion. Why aren't invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies a cause great enough to cause the universe? Or, I don't know, magical unicorn farts. Just make something up because that's all they're doing in this instance. They can't demonstrate that there are any gods, much less the one that they worship. It's just a placeholder for their own ignorance and emotional comfort. They want it to be true, therefore they declare it to be true. But that doesn't make it true.
Conclusion? Therefore, God exists.
And there we go. Invent a false argument, make up a solution that you have no evidence for whatsoever, and conclude, conveniently, that you were right all along. But guess what? Lots of other religions are all doing the exact same thing, just with other deities in place of the Christian God. Seriously, go watch Muslim videos or Hindu videos. They're mostly using the same kind of cosmological argument with the serial numbers filed off, making the same kind of empty, indefensible claims because they really want their own conclusions to be true, whether they are or not. Yet, if you look at any of this critically, which you really have to, every single one of these premises falls apart under the weight of their own irrationality. It's why this doesn't impress anybody with a brain, but then again, the already religiously delusional, they don't have that, do they? Or at least they're not using them skeptically, and that's not something that anybody ought to be proud of.
Imagine a group of friends. Angela needs a jacket because she's cold. She turns to Luke and asks, "Can I borrow a jacket from you?" Luke says, "Of course, but I don't have a jacket. Let me borrow one from my friend Dalton." So he turns to Dalton and he asks to borrow a jacket. Dalton is willing to lend Luke a jacket, but he does not have one either. So he turns to Matt and he asks Matt if he can borrow a jacket. And Matt says, "I don't have one, but I know someone who does." He tries to borrow a jacket from another member of the group. That person tries to borrow a jacket from another person. This series is made up of borrowing lenders.
And that's a really stupid analogy. I hope nobody's surprised. Hell, by the time they were done with all that crap, she could have just gone home and got her own jacket. But this is where they fail. They take what they're familiar with and then they extrapolate that to everything else. But that's not how anything actually works. The universe is not the same as a bunch of cold teenagers. Reality is often not intuitive. This is just taking your own ignorance and pretending that you have any clue whatsoever what you're talking about. In fact, this happens a lot at all levels of Christian apologetics, not just the low levels that people like Daniel King inhabit. There are videos on YouTube where people like Sean Carroll are just schooling William Lane Craig on his asinine assertions, and as we all know, Craig doesn't care about the truth. He doesn't take the demonstrable expertise of someone who knows a hell of a lot more than he does to heart, because he just doesn't give a damn. It's all, well, it feels right to me. But that isn't an indication that it's actually right. To be actually right, you have to objectively have a clue, and none of these people actually care about that. They're just trying to scam the gullible out of their money and say comforting crap to the idiots in the pews. Remember, the first 3 links King provides are money-making opportunities. For him, of course. He's selling his stuff to dumb people in the audience. Because it always comes down to that, doesn't it?
If there is an infinite series of borrowing lenders, no one will ever get a jacket. If everyone in the group has to borrow a jacket, then no one actually has a jacket. In order for the circle of borrowing to come to an end, someone has to actually own a jacket. In other words, you have to stop the series with a first lender who has a jacket.
And from this, he'll pretend that means there has to be a God. You know, a God that violates his first premise way back from the beginning. That's why people like William Lane Craig, they've moved on to the Coulomb cosmological argument, which specifies things that begin to exist. Why? Because he realizes that just saying that everything that exists has to have a cause, well, that reflects poorly on his imaginary friend. What caused God to exist? It's why it's kind of a surprise that any apologist out there doesn't see the problem up front with the standard cosmological model. It's why King is really just shooting for the dumbest people among the dumb, who also ought to be able to see the problem here, but they're simply not interested.
In the same way, if one thing causes another thing, and that thing is caused by something else, eventually one has to come to a first mover or a first causer. A first causer is someone who exists by his very nature.
Which, again, violates your first premise. Either God can't exist, or your premise is wrong, and thus the entire cosmological argument collapses under the weight of its own stupidity. If everything that exists has a cause, then you can't make an ad hoc exception for that thing over there. Everything is everything. It's not everything except for this thing that I'm going to make up out of whole cloth because it helps out my belief system. This is really where the religious have problems, and no matter how many times these problems are explained to them, they can't get it through their tiny little heads, mostly because they're not using them to begin with. This is a bald rationalization to get them to an emotionally comforting conclusion that they came to before they even started making arguments. It's not a rational evaluation of reality trying to get to the objective truth. I know the religious don't like it, but the truth actually matters. Maybe you ought to deal with that.
If we don't stop this chain with a being who simply has being simply in and of his own existence, then nothing else could exist.
Says who? Because this is just, it seems to me, thinking, which is fallacious on its face. This is one of the logical fallacies from personal incredulity. It's an appeal to common sense, where common sense isn't actually reasonable. It's saying, well, I see the world this way, therefore that's how the world is. But that's not necessarily true, is it? This is exactly why the various religions can use the same arguments to come to completely different answers. Well, of course Krishna is real, would say the Hindu, just like the Christian would say that about God. Why? Because they all want their foundational myths to be so, even if there's no good reason to think that they are. That's why these "therefore God" arguments are so ridiculously asinine. What's different between "therefore God" and "therefore Krishna" or "therefore Marduk killed Tiamat" as an explanation? Why not Pangu from Chinese traditional cosmology? What makes your God the one, especially since you can't prove that your God is real? That's the question that we need to be asking, and it's one that they have absolutely no coherent answers for.
There has to be a being in the chain that has being in and of himself. He cannot gain his being from someone else. We call this being necessary because without his existence, nothing else would exist.
Well, that's your claim. Now back it up. And since we all know that he won't, prove that it's your deity, not somebody else's. Because this is as far as they ever go. a bald assertion that there has to be a first cause based on their just so understanding of reality. Their ignorance. And then, of course, it has to be the one that they believe in because that's what makes them happy. And that's all that ultimately matters. But it's not really. What ultimately matters is the truth. What's actually going on. How you feel about it is completely irrelevant. If there is a God, you have to demonstrate how you got there rationally and evidentially. And good luck on that. Because this is exactly why he's not talking to us. Because we'd roast his ass alive. You can't get from, I really wish this was the case, so it is, to this really is the case, and here's how I know it. The former is completely pointless, and the latter is impossible for the religious because they're not at all concerned about the truth. That's the lesson that everybody needs to take away from this. They don't care. Because anybody who did care, they wouldn't be running on faith and fifis like the religious are. They'd be on the search for evidence, and the religious don't have any. They just have assertions, and assertions absent evidence mean absolutely nothing.
So eventually, we come to an on-made maker, an on-created creator, or an on-moved mover.
Yeah, I don't think that's how those words are pronounced. I mean, I'm not making fun of his accent or anything, I'm just pointing it out. What I will point out, though, is the fact that he's just violated his first premise again, because if everything requires something to create it, then by definition, there can't be an uncreated creator. Words mean things for a reason. Everything doesn't get to have exceptions, and if you grant exceptions, you don't get to limit it to your favored cause. If God doesn't need a creator, then the universe doesn't need a creator. It doesn't mean there needs to be an intelligent creator at all. Nature, so far as we can tell, works out just fine. But we're not trying to reach an emotionally comforting conclusion like he is, right? Because we're not in this for the feels. We're only here for the reals.
This necessary first cause is what we call God.
Real quick here, but I don't care what you call it. This comes up a lot. They just attach a label that they like to a lot of things and figure, well, we've just figured it all out. Call it Binky the farting leprechaun for all I care. That doesn't mean that's actually what it is. You'd have to actually prove it, and I don't think they're up to the challenge. It's why these claims don't actually get them anywhere useful. Not like they give a damn.
God is the uncaused cause. The cosmological proof states that everything in the universe has been caused, one cause after another, all the way back to a great uncaused cause, whom we call God.
And in so doing, you entirely destroy your own argument. I think it's really important to recognize just how badly they fail at all this all the time, right?
This argument is validated by the first verse of the Bible that says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth."
It doesn't matter what it says in your ridiculous book of mythology. You don't care about the Quran or the Vedas or any other holy book. Why do you think we should care about yours? Of course, this is just him proving that he's not talking to the skeptics. He's not trying to prove God to people who don't already believe it. He's only talking to those who already believe, and in that case, why is he doing this long-running series? He's got to know that it's not going to be remotely impressive to anybody who falls outside of his faith. It's just an attempt to convince the already deluded that they're already right by saying a bunch of emotionally comforting nonsense and quoting Bible verses. But that doesn't make any of it true. Now, when this actually comes out, and that's going to be a while, it's usually about 2 months between the time I make it and the time it airs, unless you're a Patreon follower and then you get it right away, I'm sure somebody will run over and, politely if you please, point out all the problems that King has, but He's not going to see it that way, will he? Any more than a Muslim apologist would recognize all the problems with their logic, or a Hindu would understand all the places that they're going wrong. Why? Because none of them care. Because the facts are inconvenient and they get in the way of their feelings. And that's just sad, isn't it?
Look at Sir Isaac Newton's laws of motion. His first law states that a body at rest stays at rest unless moved upon by outside forces. The second law states that the change of momentum of a body is proportional to the impulse impressed on the body and happens along the straight line on which that impulse is impressed. His third law states to every action there is always an equal and opposite reaction.
And in some places, Newton was wrong. Einstein proved that. This is the problem with trying to rely on any idea for all time. We learn new things constantly. Our understanding grows. What we think is true today could be overturned tomorrow by new discoveries. The religious seem to think that's a weakness of science, but it's the ultimate strength. It's how we get better. They're just standing there reading a book that is, at best, 2,000 years out of date, believing things for emotional reasons, and rejecting anything that gets in the way of their feelings. And that is utterly childish. But I want it to be true. That doesn't matter. We get closer to truth in incremental steps. We might never actually reach it, but we get closer every single day, every time we make new observations and learn new things, and adjust our thinking to reflect them. That's how knowledge works in the real world. But they don't want knowledge. They want immediate perfection because it makes them happy. They want to know everything now because it's uncomfortable admitting to their own ignorance. Therefore, they adopt the ultimate ignorance because playing make-believe makes them happier than just admitting that we're still learning. These people are dumb. They really are. Maybe it's time they all grew the hell up.
Newton's laws of motion tell us that every movement has a cause. So I want you to think about a pool table. The black 8 ball stays at rest on the table until it is hit by another object.
Or somebody bumps the table, or an earthquake happens, or there's a strong breeze, or a big truck goes by outside. There's lots of options that can be mentioned, and this is the problem with the kind of simplistic answers and the simplistic thinking that King is employing. Now, you can say, it's just an example, it doesn't matter. But it's an example that he's screwing up and simplifying down to its most basic level because that's where his intended audience lives. These are not deep thinkers. They are wishful thinkers. King isn't any better. In fact, I just went to look at the comments on his video, and somebody pointed out where he's failed with the cosmological argument, just like I did. King responded, changing the subject, saying, well, I've got lots of other videos that prove God. He can't acknowledge his own problems. He just points and shouts, hey, look over there, like a 5-year-old. This guy is an idiot. He really is. It's why I think it's important to call him and other apologists out on their crap.
No matter how long the ball sits there, it will never fall into the corner pocket unless a chain reaction from player to cue ball knocks the 8 ball into the hole. Every movement has a cause. The cause itself is a movement. The movement of the cause has its own cause, and so too a chain of causes. But a chain that hangs on nothing is impossible to conceive.
No, it's not. I mean, it might be for you, since you don't strike me as particularly creative. It's why all of the Christian claims generally come down to, well, it seems to me. Yeah, I'm sure it does, because you're just not that smart. You have less than a high school level of understanding of logic, reason, and evidence. You just want it to be true. But that doesn't mean that it is. It's why we ask these questions. How do you know that? It seems to me isn't a rational answer to provide. I really want it to be true. But that's utterly dumb. It makes me happy. It's about as childish as you can get. How do you actually know that, and how have you come to that conclusion through any kind of justifiable, evidence based, critically evaluated method? Because I want to is stupid. It really is. What justifiable methodology have you practiced in the pursuit of actual truth, actual knowledge, actual reality? Because these people have never given it a shot. Because these people are just absurdly dumb.
Hence the concept of an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover. Aristotle, who lived back in 384 BC, was the first to propose the idea of an unmoved mover. Aristotle did not know of the Christian God, but he did understand that someone must be the cause of the universe.
Now, you notice that he's appealing to people who've been dead for centuries or longer, right? Because that's the level of intellect that these people have. Every apologist appeals to the long dead and ideas best left in the grave. Why? Because that's what it takes to find somebody who agrees with them. And it's not about finding the facts, it's about finding comfort that counts. They aren't interested in truth for the sake of truth. They want to get that dopamine buzz from their beliefs, no matter how ludicrous those beliefs happen to be. That's why Christianity, the core set of beliefs, they very rarely ever change significantly. On rare occasions, some sect might leap forward into semi-rationality for a few seconds, but for the most part, especially for the fundamentalists and the evangelicals, they're still following the Bronze Age nonsense that they've been following for generations. Why? Because these are not smart people, of course.
Thomas Aquinas, who lived in 1224 AD, was the greatest Western philosopher of the medieval age.
Wait, what the hell did he say?
Was the greatest Western What
the hell is that? All right, whatever. Get to your point on your old fart theistic thinker, because it's not going to be impressive anyhow.
And he thought that the first and more manifest way to prove God's existence was the proof from motion. His reasoning is as follows. Premise A, things move.
Okay, look, let's disprove Aquinas. It's not that difficult. Yes, things move. So what? Of course, this is just going to go right back to the standard "therefore God" nonsense, where he just arbitrarily assigns a cause to things that he didn't understand because fifis. This doesn't impress anyone. Just because you desperately want an explanation for things that you currently don't comprehend, that doesn't mean that you just get to make something up so you don't feel so bad. Because that is utterly childish. That's why the scientific method works the way that it does. You can hypothesize whatever you'd like, but thereafter it has to get to the verification phase. And the religious, they don't want to pay any attention to that kind of experimentation. They don't like it because it proves what they believe is wrong. It's true because they want it to be true, not because it can be demonstrated to be true. And there's a problem with that, but let's let his example play out.
Premise B, nothing moves itself, since everything that is moved must be moved by another. Premise C, if that which causes the motion is itself being moved, then it must be moved by another. Premise D, this process of movement cannot go on to infinity. Conclusion, therefore there must be a first unmoved mover, which people call God.
Therefore God. no evidence required. It's true because he wants it to be true, so there. But guess what? Abu al-Walid Muhammad bin Ahmad bin Rashid. And I know I just completely butchered that name, I'm sorry, but he said the exact same thing about Allah back in the 1100 CE. And that means he came up with it about 100 years before Aquinas. Funny how that works, right? In fact, Aquinas got the idea from him. I bet King is completely clueless about that too.
When Aquinas talks about motion, he means more than movement from one place to another. Rather, he is referring to change of any kind, whether change from life to death, growth, learning, heating, cooling, or any other possibility. All kinds of motion or change or development must have an ultimate, on-moving, on-changing, complete cause.
Well, that's the claim. Yet it's a claim you haven't bothered to demonstrate, isn't it? You're certainly not alone because Aquinas didn't demonstrate it either. It was just an empty claim then that he yanked completely out of his ass because, to his primitive mind, that was all that he could come up with, especially given his religious background. This is being steered by unjustified beliefs, not by the evidence at hand, because who the hell cares about that, right? Oh yeah, rational people, that's who. You know, people that King has no interest in hearing from.
The importance of understanding causation led Aquinas to develop further logical proofs, including another version of the cosmological proof. He says, premise A, things are caused. Premise B, everything that is caused by something else. Premise C, an infinite regress of causation is impossible. Conclusion, there must be an uncaused cause of all that is caused. This uncaused cause is God.
Well, that's certainly your claim. Now back it up with something more than your flapping lips. Because here's the problem. None of them can. Therefore, God is horribly unimpressive to anybody who isn't already operating on blind faith and overactive fifis. This works for any religion out there. The Muslims and the Hindus, they might put a different deity in there. So would the Ananang people of Nigeria, who would say it's the spirit of Abasi, the ancient Turkic belief, which would say Kyra, and for the Mayans, it would be Huracan. Just because you really want it to be your God, that doesn't make it your God. You have to do a whole lot better than that, but he can't because he doesn't want to. His intended audience doesn't care so long as they get that zap of dopamine in the head, and they're not deep thinkers regardless. They just wish really hard, and that's not impressive, is it? Daniel King most certainly isn't. He's kind of a frickin' joke. And I trust nobody is surprised. Anyhow, that's where I'm going to stop this time, although honestly, I'm kind of having a hard time imagining where he can go from here. He's completely screwed up the cosmological argument already, but I don't suspect he's going to care about that. I'll post this to his page if he's still got the guts to keep it up and see what he has to say, but I doubt he's going to have any coherent, intelligent response. So far, he's just made excuses, and that's kind of sad. It's also not at all surprising because that's really all that any theist can do. You actually have to get somewhere beyond because I say so. And they have a real problem doing that, right? Because the problem with these arguments are so numerous and they really don't seem to care. So anyway, what do you think? Let me know down below. Do you think that King can pull this out in the end, or will it be the same kind of question-begging, wishful-thinking garbage that he's done in the first half? He's so kindly reminded me that his next video is on the Kalam, so we'll be able to take that one apart too. Because none of these arguments, these so-called proofs for God, are going to impress anybody with a brain. It's just pandering to the religiously deluded. And that's really, really sad.
bum.